Hello everyone, my name is David McMurdo and welcome to Experiential Spirituality Episode 8 Rise. I hope you caught all of that because I know that this live streaming doesn't necessarily catch the first few seconds of what you say. Last year I created 7 episodes of Experiential Spirituality and they were to lay the groundwork for all that followed. Those first 7 episodes, they're very focused and each episode deals with a different subject, but I knew that I would eventually return on a weekly basis permanently in order to do a more laid back, relaxed live show, because in those first 7 episodes I don't think I ever once responded to anyone in chat as I'd done previously because I really wanted them to be super focused. So I knew I'd return to do a more casual live show on a deeply basis when I had the deeply basis on a permanent basis when I had finished up my projects, which I have, kind of. And I thought, well, there's no better day to return on. There's no better day to rise again on than Easter, and that's why I'm back today. Although, first of all, you can probably hear the wind outside. It's ridiculously windy here in the Highlands at the moment. But I can't promise you a very efficient show today because it's amazing how quickly you fall out of practice doing these live streams. I had to remind myself, refresh myself on everything, all the technical aspects of doing it, how to configure OBS with YouTube. I had to refresh myself with all of that again, and so I can't promise you an entirely polished show today. This is going to be a warm-up session, if anything. Now, I mentioned that I would only return to do these live shows when I felt that I'd got certain projects out the way, and of course the most major project was my book, which I'm going to speak about in a second. But as I said, I want this experiential spirituality live stream to be more laid back than the first 7 episodes were by design, and so as ever I take questions from everywhere, whether you want to leave them in the YouTube comment section, in the live chat, or through Curious Cat. I'm surprised more souls don't use Curious Cat because I get a lot of questions through Curious Cat, and yet I never see anyone else on social media mentioning it. I don't know why. I thought it would be a whole lot popular than it is. But yeah, feel free to ask me any questions you might want to ask me. The first thing I want to do or share with you in this live stream is something that I did share before, just not in Experiential Spirituality. And as far as I'm concerned, nothing is officially on record until it's shared within these Experiential Spirituality live streams. And that is my DNA results from Ancestry.com, which I said several years ago that I was going to do, and I got round to it late last year. And so these are my results. I fully expected to have some Scandinavian DNA within me, but apparently I don't. I was very impressed with the detail that this ethnicity estimate is capable of. It narrows my lineage down to the Highlands, to Caithness, where I currently live, and I have no intentions of going anywhere else. But since getting this result, I've been jokingly saying to my friends, this qualifies me to be the King of Scotland, definitely the King of the Celts, because I got a bit of something from every Celtic nation in the British Isles. So yeah, I've been annoying my friends by claiming to have the blood of King Arthur within me. But yeah, I mean, the results are fine. I was more curious than anything. I don't know if the price of getting these tests done is really worth it, because the reason I went with Ancestry instead of 23andMe is that 23andMe has more of an emphasis on the health side of things, and I was only interested in the Ancestry side of things. But the Ancestry website, it allows you to create your own family tree. You can get access to all kinds of census records, so you can really develop your own family tree in a lot of detail. But I'm not really interested in anything like that. I just wanted to know what my genetic composition was, essentially. But I've been getting a lot of private messages on the Ancestry website, because you can make your results public, and the website tells you who your cousins are, whether they're your second, third, or fourth cousin, whatever it might be. So I've got a lot of messages from people from around the world saying, hey, do you know who this individual is in our shared lineage, and I was like, I don't have a clue. I just wanted to, I just wanted to see what my genetic composition was, and it's just something I wanted to get out of the way because it's just one of those things that's very nice to know, essentially, and so. The most major thing that I'm being concerned with, of course, is my book. Now, my book is finished, and the book is that which all of my live streams will at one point be centered around. But of course, that is dependent upon the book being published. Now, of course, I could easily publish the book myself and develop a nice little readership for it, but I really feel that to do so would be to sell it short, because I'm an avid reader. I've read a lot of spiritual books especially, and I know that this book is something fresh and unique, and I think that to do it justice, I really have to go the traditional publishing route, which means, for those who don't know, getting a literary agent. And what a literary agent does for you is essentially contact publishers on your behalf. They have contacts in all of the publishers, so if they like your book and they choose to represent you, they begin negotiating with publishers on your behalf. But this is a new experience for me. I've never explored this world before, and I will tell you it's been very eye-opening because the book is finished. It's 90,582 words, which is about 350 pages, something like that. That would depend upon the font and the size of the page and so forth. That's why writers usually go by word count, because it's far more specific than page count. I thought that once the book is done, that's the really challenging part over, especially for me as someone who is a perfectionist in my personhood. I'm someone who, if I don't discipline myself, will revise my work over and over and over and over again until 10 years down the line and it's still sitting on my hard drive. So I got my book to a place that I was really satisfied with, and for me that was a major personal achievement. I would go so far as to say that it's the greatest thing I've done in my life. There's a real sense of achievement when you finish a book, especially a book as complicated as that, because quite frankly, given the subject matter, I could have made the book 200,000 words long and not repeated myself once. So there had to be a lot of skill employed in terms of how I explain things enough, but not so much that it becomes distracting, because I did want to make this book accessible. And so my expectation was that once I've got the book done, that's the hard part out of the way. Then I look for literary agents here in the United Kingdom, and I see which ones would be best to send my book to. And I thoroughly expected to end up with dozens of potential literary agents that I could send my book to. But the reality is, I found exploring the world of literary agents, at least here in the United Kingdom, to be an extremely alienating experience. And I wouldn't necessarily have to explain this. If you just go onto Google and you type in UK literary agent and have a look at the kind of people that pop up, and if you have a look at the kind of authors they represent, you've got to ask yourself, can I imagine David among those authors? And the clear answer is no. The only way I can explain it is that there's a certain middle class vibe to the literary world as far as I've seen so far. And even though I'm fairly soft spoken and I think I articulate myself well, he says as he stumbles upon his words, I think I articulate myself well and I think I write well. Ultimately, I'm just a scruffy Highland scrub. I'm a working class scruffy Highland scrub. That's what I am. And it's always been the case that I've never been comfortable in certain middle class environments. I'm not really the kind of person, despite how soft spoken I am, and I am polite, of course, but there's a certain part of me that's not all that civilized. I'm not necessarily the kind of person you want in polite company. And so looking at these literary agents, there's that first of all. I feel like I'm looking into a world that I'm just not part of and that I wouldn't belong in. And then there's also the fact that many of these literary agents, they don't even acknowledge the spirituality or the mind, body and spirit genre that my book would naturally belong in. Some of them actually outright say they are not interested in that kind of work. So as well as the whole kind of middle class vibe that I'm not really comfortable with, there's also a very secular vibe in many cases as well. So whereas I thought I'd have dozens of literary agents that I could potentially send my work to, it's come down to about a handful. And it's not easy contacting these people either, because each of them has very specific requirements of what they demand of you. In some cases, it seems like you're having to write an entirely new book because they want an elaborate synopsis on what you've written, which is very, I don't know. I would just rather it was the case that, look, here I am, here's why I'm contacting you, here's the book, I hope you like it, I hope you choose to represent me. But it's not as simple as that. You can't just choose your literary agents and then fire off the same email to all of them. You've got to approach each of them individually and meet each of their very specific standards. And so to my surprise, approaching literary agents is proving to be a project in itself. And it's and that's what I'm doing right now, and it's the reason I wasn't sure if I was going to return on this particular Sunday, because I'm still quite caught up in doing that. That's the stage I'm at with the book just now. The book is done. I just need to get someone to represent me, essentially, and it's not proving to be an easy task at all, because, as I said, this is an entirely new experience for me. This is not a world I'm familiar with. It's apparently not a world I'm very comfortable in, but there are a handful of literary agents that I think would be willing to entertain a book of this nature, would be willing to entertain me. So it's just a matter of contacting them to find out. But this is very clearly, we're talking about response times of up to 2 or 3 months. So this is not something that's going to happen anytime soon. You know, I would love the book to be out there tomorrow now that it's finished, but the literary world very clearly does move at a glacial pace, which is fine because I've got nothing but time. I'm very patient. I'm just very eager to get the book out there so that others can read it. But that's the situation just now. I'm having to contend with the world of literary agents, and it's been a very eye-opening and a very informative experience. I've just got to find the one that's right for me, essentially, and I don't know when that will happen. But that's what's been going on just now. Oh, hello Greta, and hello Nicholas, and hello Ageratos Henosis. I recognise you from not just from these live streams, but I must say that I would never have got this book finished. And this is not an advertisement, of course. You know my way. I don't ask money for anything unless I'm producing a work like a book. This is a genuine recommendation here. I would never have finished my book without these. These are Cyrix blue light glasses. I've been interested in looking and getting a pair for a while, because the way I work typically is that I'll wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I'll write for 3 or 4 hours before I do anything else. And in the past I have suffered from severe eye strain and severe headaches, and I've been recommended these glasses before, and it's just something I put off for a long time until a few months ago. So I got these glasses, and what they do is that they protect your eyes from blue light that apparently comes from your monitor. I don't know the exact details of it, but in the case of these Cyrix glasses, they actually came with this little blue torch so that you can see how they work. Now, these are very expensive, and I've got a funny feeling that I paid quite a bit of money just for this torch, which I could have done without. I'll take your word for it, you know. But, you know, if you shine it through the glasses, the light doesn't shine through, and it's just a way of demonstrating it to yourself. But I've got to say, and again, I'm not being paid to say this is genuine, these are transformative, because now the only limitation to how long I can write for is essentially how much my mind can cope with, because writing is a very mentally exhausting process. And in the past, Neurocraft, David McMurdo, you son of a bitch, hugs. Yeah, I thought you were going for a Predator thing there, but Dylan and Dutch didn't hug each other. They did the arm wrestle thing. But we can adapt, it's fine. So in the past, you know, I was limited in terms of how long I could write for, based on, you know, how long will it be before I get crippling eye strain? How long will it be before I get a crippling headache? But now the only limitation is, you know, how long will it be before I'm just so mentally exhausted I can't write anymore, and it's thanks to these glasses. Again, they're not cheap, but if you are someone who suffers from eye strain or headaches from looking at a monitor, then I can't recommend these enough. The only issue is that I feel I've become quite reliant on them, because in the beginning I only wore them whenever I was writing something or reading something long on my monitor, and then I would take them off. But they proved to be so effective that I just find myself wearing them all the time around my flat. Not in public, obviously, but yeah, again, they're not prescription glasses, they're just designed to help you with blue light. And I would never have got my book done without these, because again, they allowed me to write for extensive periods of time. It really was like acquiring some kind of superpower. So one thing I want to talk about in this stream, and it's connected with the theme of rising. Even though these live streams are going to be more laid back than they have been in the first 7 episodes, because those first 7 episodes, I will tell you, it's asking for the spelling of Cyrix. It says here, it's not even Cyrix, it's Cyrixus, actually. Cyxus. But if you just Google or go into Amazon and look for blue light glasses, you'll find a whole variety of them. Even though these live streams from now on will be less structured and more fluid, more dynamic than the first 7 were by design, I do want each episode to have a theme. The theme of this episode, given that it is Easter Day, is naturally rising, but not just spiritually, which is what I'll conclude this stream with, but in all kinds of ways, because there's a phenomenon that's been on my mind of late. And it's about putting yourself out there in the world. It's a difficult thing to do, and obviously this has been on my mind because I finished a book and I'm presenting it to the world, and I am in that book speaking in a very authoritative and assertive way about spiritual subject matter. It takes a lot of guts to do that, and I'm not boasting here, I'm just stating a matter of fact. It does take a lot of guts to put yourself out in the world in any way. You can probably hear the wind, it's so bad today. And I was thinking lately, because of course the moment you put yourself out there, and it doesn't matter what your interest is, what your subject is. Now, I don't know what destiny God has in store for anyone watching here, or for anyone who will watch this stream in the future. I don't know what your interests might be, and invariably the destiny that God has in store for you will involve your interest in some way. You know, if you've had a passion for a particular thing for a very young age, then it's almost a guarantee that the destiny that God has in store for you involves that passion. It's almost a guarantee. The reason I say that is because so often when we speak about God and the destiny that God has in store for us, we kind of get this image in our minds of like the Old Testament prophet who's going to stand up in a soapbox and tell his community why they're wrong and why if they don't change their ways they're going to be destroyed. You know, that could be the destiny that God has in store for you, but more than likely not. But whatever your destiny is, it's going to require you at some point to put yourself out there in the world, to stand up in front of the whole world and say, okay, this is me, this is who I am, and this is what I'm presenting you with. And that takes a lot of courage to do. And of course, the moment you do that, you're going to have people saying, well, who do you think you are, and why do you think this is good enough to be put out there? It doesn't matter what area you're focused on, you're going to receive that. My thing is that I've noticed in life, and I noticed this a long time ago, you know, when you're a kid, you naturally think that adults have it all figured out. You naturally think that the adult world knows exactly what it's doing and things are going exactly as they should. But as you get older, you begin to realise that the adults about you, actually, they're pretty much making up as they go along as well. And they so often have no idea what they're doing. In fact, in some cases, they're pretty incompetent. But then as you begin to be involved in different areas, like professional areas, whether it's within academia or in some kind of industry, and I'm sure many of you have had this experience, it is actually quite shocking how many people in high positions of power really have no clue what they're doing. And you realise that so many people in this world are kind of faking it. Not in the sense that they're being insincere, but in the sense that they're they're intentionally projecting a confidence that is not true to how confident they actually are. And when you realize that, you realize how you can just dominate in any given circumstance. You can assert yourself in any given circumstance because you've come to see that those people that seem so confident around about you, they're not actually so confident, and that they're not likely to resist you much if you're assertive and authoritative with them, which you sometimes have to be in this world. So what I've realised, and what I realised a long time ago, is that whereas a lot of souls seem to think that authority is something that is either bestowed upon you by good fortune, or it's something that you work towards, which in many cases it is, so often in this world I've come to see authority is something you can simply take. You can simply assert yourself as an authority on something, and people will listen to you. That's a fact. And the problem with doing that, of course, is that you have to be able to back it up. If you stand up as an authority on something, you're going to receive questions and all kinds of things related to that subject matter, so you have to be able to back it up. But the fact is that authority is there for the taking. And that's one thing I want to impress upon people, is that no matter what your interest is, no matter what your focus is, if you just demonstrate courage and are willing to stand up and put yourself and your work out there, regardless of, again, what it is, whether it's some kind of art project or whether it's some kind of political idea, whatever it is, if you're willing to do that, I think you'd be surprised at how positively souls respond to you. But of course, there are always going to be those souls that, not even criticise, because criticism is fine, but souls that just seem to have the sole intent to tear you down. Now, the word loser is used a lot in modern society, and it's not a word I tend to use because the word loser is typically associated with material gain or failure. And obviously, having a focus on spirituality, material failure or gain is not something that concerns me. The great mystics of history have invariably been very poor precisely because they didn't focus on material matters. So I don't use the word loser a lot, or at all in fact, because it's associated with material wealth. See, I'm so out of practice speaking that my voice is gone already. But if I was forced to use the word loser, it would be best applied to those that do have something to say, to those that do have something to present to the world, and yet they simply don't because they don't have the courage to do so. Because what I've noticed is that those souls will invariably become the very souls who seem to do nothing with their lives except tear other souls down. And that's why, if there's any collective of souls that should have the term loser applied to it, it's certainly that. Because not having had the courage themselves to put themselves and their work out there, they instead focus on tearing down, because it's easier to tear down than it is to build up. It's always been far easier to be destructive than to be creative. But it is easy to be assertive in this world. It is easy to be authoritative in this world, because most souls out there, they aren't confident at all. Their confidence is projected, and in my experience, even the most confident soul is making a conscious effort to project that confidence. And for as long as you know that they're going to give way fairly easily. Now, speaking on spiritual matters is a little different, because there are no qualifications in spirituality. There's no, well, let's say there are very few workplaces where you can gain experience in spirituality. There are some, and I've had experience in it, specifically 2 years as the marketing and media manager of the biggest New Age fair in Scotland. So I've got that real world experience, which is more than most can ever have, in fairness. But ultimately, when you're speaking on spiritual matters, what's going to count in the end is results. It doesn't matter what what claim you make about yourself. And for reasons of ego, I obviously don't make grandiose claims about myself. But what matters is results. Is what you're saying helpful, or is it not helpful? Do souls benefit from what you're saying, or do they not benefit? In terms of spirituality, that is all that is ever going to matter. Nothing else is going to matter. Are people willing to listen to what you have to say because they benefit from what you have to say? So as long as I'm fulfilling that much, as long as I'm saying things that are useful to souls, then I'm fulfilling my purpose as far as spirituality is concerned. So I'm just going to turn to the comments briefly. Nicholas Holmes says, I have a question. Before you began the Experiential Spirituality series, you had another numbered series of live streams where you spoke about mysticism, politics, and had an interval. How come you decided to scrap that? Great question. Thank you for that. That is a genuine question, but that almost seems like a question that someone would set up because they want to give the answer. But yes, what was the Mystic Moment? I think my last series of live streams was called. The reason I scrapped that is because the Mystic Moment was very much a trial run, because I was completely new to how to do live streams like this on YouTube. It wasn't something I was experienced with, and the reason I changed it is because I wanted the live stream to share the same title as my book, because I very much want Experiential Spirituality to be a recognized name. So the books go by that name, this live stream goes by that name, and anything else will go by that name. That's why I changed that, essentially. One thing about myself, and maybe some of you watching can empathise with this, but when it comes to books, both as a reader and as a writer, I care very little for anything outside of the chapters of a book. So even though when I'm reading a book, I will read the introduction, I will read the prologue and the epilogue and what have you, just because it's there, my focus isn't really fully invested until chapter 1 begins. Then I'm really paying attention. And it's the same when I'm writing. I don't really care what's Leo says, locks looking glorious. Yes, thank you. The colour on this webcam, or the contrast on this webcam is such, is that I've got a very Gandalf the White vibe here. So when I was writing this book, I wanted to write an introduction because it's very important to me that the people reading the book are aware of these live streams, because these live streams will ultimately centre around the book. But that's the sole reason I wanted to write an introduction. Everything else is contained within the pages of the book. And there's a certain section in the first chapter that I'm pretty sure many literary agents would look at and say, okay, this shouldn't be in the first chapter, this should be in the introduction, because I'm explaining why I use the terminology that I do. And if they do respond to me saying that, I'm going to have to explain my philosophy of not really caring about anything that's outside of the chapters of a book. I mean, that's just the way that I am. I had problems with assertiveness growing up and find it very valuable nowadays. Lots of trial and error. Yes, I mean, I'm the same, because I'm, in my personhood, I'm an introvert and I'm a loner. I like to be alone, and obviously when I'm live streaming like this, I have to speak because that's the whole point. But if you were to encounter me in the real world, I'm not running my mouth off like this constantly. On the contrary, I would, if you see me sitting in a waiting room, for example, I'm just going to be sitting there quietly saying nothing. Even if I'm on the rare occasion where I go to a social gathering, I'll just quite happily sit there saying nothing, because I'm comfortable with myself. I'm comfortable with silence in a way that most souls aren't, and so I'll rarely speak at all. So I'm not someone who is naturally assertive either. It's just something you have to quite simply choose to be. Otherwise, other souls are going to walk all over you, as it were. So obviously today is Easter, and unfortunately, when I think of Easter, I don't just think of the resurrection of Yeshua and everything else that most souls would think of. I think of all of the silly, philosophical, materialist comments about this time of year. You know, the idea that Yeshua is a glorified zombie, for example. The idea that Christians are worshipping a zombie. Of course, that's completely wrong, and I realise that such statements aren't to be taken seriously and scrutinised, but I'm going to anyway, because a zombie can be two things, right? There is actually real-life zombies, in that, I believe it's in Haiti, or it's part of a voodoo practice whereby you have a certain concoction of chemicals, and I believe that one of those chemicals at least comes from the pufferfish, if I recall correctly. I'm not an expert on voodoo, but I'm just going from memory here. And essentially, there is a concoction you can make that renders the physical body so comatose almost that it's very hard to detect signs of life. And in many cases, those who have been exposed to this substance, they have been declared dead, but they weren't dead, so they've ended up being buried alive and so forth. And there's a theory that tales from Central America and from Haiti, that part of the world, about people rising from the dead they actually stem from this form of zombification, where they've been exposed to this substance. Others have thought they were dead, but they really weren't dead. So that's one kind of zombie, the kind of Haitian voodoo zombie that isn't really a zombie, it's just someone that was mistaken for dead. But then, of course, there's the fantasy zombie, which is an undead being that is resurrected by the dark power of some kind of evil sorcerer, usually a necromancer, sometimes a vampire. You know, Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, very popular in Tolkien, of course. So there's two kinds of zombies, the two kinds of zombies that I can think of. And of course, Yeshua doesn't qualify as either one, because Yeshua wasn't raised as a desiccated corpse. He was raised in full spiritual life. That's the whole point. So he wasn't raised as a form of subhuman, which is what a zombie is. He was raised as a form of superhuman, who, after spending time with the disciples, then ascended to heaven. And again, the insult that Christians worship a glorified zombie is obviously not something to be addressed seriously. But to me, it just again illustrates the kind of lazy cynicism, the willful ignorance of so much of the secular and atheistic world when it comes to religious matters. They don't know what Christian theology teaches. And again, you know, I'm no religionist. I have many criticisms of organised religion and of different kinds of religionists. But it's very obvious that Christianity in particular comes in for this kind of criticism, because these kinds of jokes and these kinds of criticisms would never be levelled at other religions. And again, I'm no Christian, I'm no religionist, but that's just a fact. And so it's really just an illustration of how little so many atheists and how little so many secularists actually care to be informed what they're talking about. If I wanted to level some criticism at the way that the resurrection is understood within Christianity for the most part, as I may go on to do in just a few moments, it would be, and it will be, an intelligent criticism that is actually truly reflective of what Christians believe and is truly reflective of what the canonical Gospels say on the subject, because I've taken the time to inform myself on the subject. So whether you agree with me or whether you don't, there's no denying that I know what I'm talking about. Whereas with so many secularists and with so many religionists, atheists, it's just this, they can't even be bothered to learn. They're just cynical about anything that isn't material. They're cynical about the supernatural, so they just dismiss it in in a very cheap and smug way. But it's very played out now. You know, that kind of thing had some kind of popularity back at the height of New Atheism back in 2007. You know, when it seemed like this New Atheism, or New Atheism as a whole, might be a force, and you had the so-called four horsemen of the apocalypse. They were, I shouldn't have started this because I may not be able to remember them all, but I want to say Richard Harris. I'm mixing two of them. No, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. I can't believe I remembered them. But they were the so-called four horsemen of the apocalypse. They all had books to sell. Those books were big successes. And atheism as a movement, especially online, was very powerful. It was certainly the dominant force here on YouTube. But we don't live in 2007 anymore. We live 15 years later, and all the big atheist names, they've kind of faded now. Atheism is not a significant force either online or anywhere else. And so I just don't think that, even if they really can't be bothered to learn about the different religions that they criticise, I just don't think that atheists and secularists can afford to be so cocky, can afford to be so cavalier in their dealings with religion, because ultimately, and this is what it is always boiled down to, they don't have any alternative to offer. When I make criticisms of the ways that different religions understand different things, I'm offering an alternative. If I wasn't offering an alternative, I wouldn't make the criticisms, because I'm not offering anything better. It's the reason that the fact that I think I've got something better to offer is the reason I would ever take the time to criticise certain approaches in the first place. But the secular world and atheism as a whole, it doesn't have that alternative. And quite frankly, after all this time, I think the folly of atheism and the folly of secularism is kind of obvious now after all this time. So yeah, I just don't think they can afford to be so cocky. Nicholas says, by the way, I've been watching your videos for a few years. Used to go by the name Dr. Oh yeah, I remember you. You inspired me to start a project of my own, a SNES style game that I've been working on for the last year. I'm going to release it in sections as it's quite big, but the first one should be in about 2 months' time. Well, that's great. I genuinely love it when souls have other projects. Projects that they're working on, because I like productive, creative souls. It's inspiring to me, even if I'm not interested in what they're saying. It's just inspiring. So this SNES style game, are you planning to sell it through Steam or something like that? Steam Greenlight, or is it just something you're working on yourself? Because I can understand that too. On my hard drive, I always loved the pulp fiction of the early 20th century, Robert E. Howard especially, and I've got a series of novellas that I've written on my hard drive that I have no intention of approaching anyone with, because I know they're not good enough. To be perfectly frank, the protagonist of those stories is like a watered down Solomon Kane, so I'm very self-aware about them, so I'm not going to approach anyone with that. But I wrote them just because I like creative writing, and that's what I did. Greta says, I was once asked to read out some of my poems to a group of students. I was really anxious about it, but it turned out quite well, and I'm glad I did it. It was less daunting than reading to writers. I tried poetry once, and I learned something about myself from that attempt. What I learned about myself is that I need rules. When I'm writing something, whether it's a creative work, some kind of fantasy, sword and sorcery story, or whether it's something on spirituality, I'm confident knowing what the rules are. I like to know, okay, that is grammatically correct, that is not grammatically correct, that sentence runs on too long. Okay, you can certainly bend the rules of writing, and each writer has their own style, but there is still certain rules, and I'm comfortable with there being rules. What really troubled me when I attempted to write poetry is that there really is no rules. The only rule I perceive when it comes to poetry is that personally, I want my poems to rhyme. And I don't really understand poetry that doesn't rhyme. I don't get it, if you know what I mean. And so I learned a lot about myself. I'm someone who shouldn't be writing poetry, I think, because I just don't get it. When I read a work of prose, I know whether I like what I'm reading, and I know whether it's good in terms of the rules of literature. But when I'm reading poetry, sometimes there'll be a poem that goes around and everyone's saying it's brilliant, and I'm reading it and I'm like, I don't get it. The only poetry I really like is that of Robert E. Howard. He wrote poems as well as fiction, but most people don't even know that Robert E. Howard wrote poems, because apparently to the world of literature they're just not really that good, or they're not that significant, but I enjoy them. I mean, I know these things are all hugely subjective, but yeah, I don't think I'm one who's going to be very good at poetry, because I do like there to be some kind of rules that I can go by. Yes, the new atheists, they are kind of boring. They are kind of tiring, because their talking points are not only old from like 15 years ago, but they've been responded to so many times now, and they've been shown, it's been demonstrated why they're silly so many times now, but it makes no difference whatsoever. They just keep on repeating the same things over and over. I think the worst thing about certain secularists and certain atheists is the patronizing attitude they have towards those with spiritual beliefs. Like, a lot of them tend to assume that the only reason that anyone has any kind of spiritual belief is because they're afraid of death, and they need that as some kind of consolation. And you can see when they're talking among themselves, that even if they're disagreeing with one another, they'll still be disagreeing on the basis of that kind of patronizing premise. So one will be saying to another, yeah, okay, what they believe is silly, but it really helps them get through the day. That's so patronizing. I never feared death at any point in my life, and I've always thought it was kind of strange as well, because what atheists, or let's say what philosophical materialists believe, is that when their mortal form dies, they will enter into oblivion. That is not scary, because as so many of them say themselves, it's just like going to sleep. The only difference is you never wake up. That is not scary. What is scary, or what is potentially scary, is the prospect of an all-knowing deity judging you for all the wrongs you have done in your life. That is a scary prospect. So when atheists and secularists talk about religion being the opiate of the masses, I think the opposite is the case. I think it's actually atheism, or this idea that there's no God, or no kind of divine justice. To me, that is the real opiate of the masses. That is the real comforting belief. And when I look at the way secularists talk, I really do get this sense that so many of them really want to believe that there is no justice in the end, so that they can keep on behaving in the quite often despicable ways that they behave. I'm very careful not to caricature any group, whether it's religionists, whether it's secularists, or whether it's philosophical materialists, but there are certain patterns that can be observed within each of these groups. Jones I says, some of us just want you to go back to your Thief LPs. And Ageratos says, Thief is a great franchise. Yes, it is. For those who don't know, they're talking about the Thief trilogy of video games, and there is a trilogy because they never made that remake. Initially developed by Looking Glass Software back in the late 90s. You got Thief 1 and 2. Thief 2 The Metal Age is probably the best by far. But you know what? I like Deadly Shadows as well. And yes, it is a great series. And I get asked about gaming a lot, because for those who don't know, I came onto YouTube back in 2005 when the website was new, and the first thing I did was video games, because at that point in my life I'd just come out of a very long relationship. I was very depressed about that, and I needed something to focus on. I needed a project to put my mind on, essentially. And the internet was new to me at that time. YouTube itself was new at the time. And I saw on YouTube there were these souls making videos about video games, and I thought, oh wow, this is great. I grew up playing video games. I have a lot to say about them, so I'll start making videos like that too. And so I did. And to this day, I get lots of people asking me about those older videos that I made, but unfortunately there's no other way to say it. I've just outgrown that, and I really have to have outgrown that, because I was 21 when I started doing video game reviews. I'm 37 years old this year, and souls can do whatever they want to do with their lives. That's their choice. But for me personally, I really feel like I've gone beyond that stage. Not that I've stopped enjoying video games. I like playing Valheim, for example. It's a great game that I've played a bit too much this week, but I can't really justify making video games a focus of my efforts at this stage in my life. I've really discovered what my purpose in this world is, in talking about spirituality, in writing books on the subject. And so that's what I really am dedicated to now. And video games, as much as I enjoyed it and as much as I appreciate the fact that other people enjoyed my content, that belongs to the past. And I'm just grateful that I never became so popular on YouTube that there's big archives of my work out there. I'm glad that I'm one of the few people where usually they say what goes on the internet stays on the internet. I'm one of the few exceptions to that because I was never popular enough for anyone to care too much. So that's good. That's one benefit. See, everything happens for a reason. Nicholas says it will be absolutely free, probably browser based initially. I'm creating it purely for the buzz of making something with my own hands. Yeah, I completely relate to that. It's like I was saying earlier, the feeling of finishing that book, something I've spent a good few years crafting because it's the third version of the book. It's so immensely satisfying, and I've never tried to develop a video game from the ground up as you're doing, but I used to work with a lot of sophisticated software in terms of map editing, like some really sophisticated software, not just like a paint program. And yeah, I can imagine someone getting an equal amount of satisfaction from that. Greta says, in poetry, you can crystallize a thought. Less is more. I like being succinct. It's a good exercise. You see, that kind of explanation of poetry works for me. I get that. It's one of the reasons, strangely enough, and I don't mean to... What I'm about to say here, it might sound like I'm taking Greta's point and I've just completely missed it, but no. But it's one of the reasons I appreciate Twitter, is that it does have that tight word count, so it forces you to be succinct. It forces you to say, what you've got to say in a very efficient way, and I like that. One thing I say in the book, and I'm so desperately trying not to make that a catchphrase, because I could say it all the time. But what I say in the book, or I point out in the book, is that because the spiritual is something that can't be encapsulated in concept or in language, historically, mystics, they have used less literal forms to express spiritual truths. The most obvious example on this Easter Sunday is, of course, Yeshua, who constantly spoke in parables. But another good example when it comes to poetry is the Islamic mystic Rumi, who is most famous for his poetry. And mystics often write in those less literal forms because, again, the spiritual truth that they're trying to convey, they can't be encapsulated within language or within a concept. And so I can certainly understand the poetry, I just know what I'm not good at. There are certain things I would really like to be good at, namely poetry, music, and art, that I'm just not good at, or at least if I am good, then I'm keeping it very well hidden from myself. But yeah, even though I'm not good at those forms myself, I certainly do appreciate those that are. So, to speak about the resurrection, to conclude this little live stream, which has been a bit of a mess, been all over the place, but I think it's gone okay actually. One funny thing, there was a tweet that went viral on Twitter yesterday, a tweet made by a professor, and this is a very secular professor, clearly a philosophical materialist herself, which is the term I like to use more than atheist, because an atheist is merely one that doesn't believe in a god or gods. It is theoretically possible for an atheist to have a very fulfilling introspective spirituality, so I don't like the term atheist. I like to say philosophical materialist. I don't just say materialist because the word materialist can refer to someone who is greedy for material things. I say philosophical materialist to indicate someone that has actually thought about the subject at hand, whether or not there is a spiritual dimension to life, and has consciously dismissed that. So rather than saying atheist, I like to use the term philosophical materialist, and it's the term I use throughout my book. So this professor, very clearly a philosophical materialist of the obnoxious kind, her tweet went viral because she said something to the effect of, reminder that people don't rise from the dead. Although it was actually kind of funny because grammatically speaking, it didn't really turn out that way. I don't know if I can very easily find it. I don't even know if I want to. It doesn't matter. But grammatically speaking, her tweet actually read like she was commanding dead people not to come back. Just the way grammatically it was structured, it was kind of funny. Only a few people picked up on that, I noticed, but it was very funny. But the thing is that, ironically, philosophical materialists like that and religionists make the exact same mistake when it comes to the subject of the resurrection. The mistake being that it's either literally true or it's completely worthless. So a secularist or an atheist or a philosophical materialist will say something like that. Dead people don't come back. And of course, she deliberately said that on Easter to inflame any Christian who saw her tweet. And so the response she gets from Christian religionists by and large, is that, well, no, look, here's evidence for the resurrection. How do you explain the empty tomb? All these kind of apologetic arguments that, quite frankly, are not convincing at all. We're talking about something that happened 2,000 years, or is alleged to have taken place 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. There is no way you're ever going to prove through materialist science that someone rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. It's just not going to happen. The best you can possibly do is hear some apologetic argument on the subject, like William Lane Craig. He loves to give arguments concerning the probability of the resurrection. And you can say to yourself, okay, I think based on this argument that it's probable that Yeshua rose from the dead. The problem is that spirituality isn't about probability or guesswork or guesstimates, it's about certainty. And the important thing about the resurrection is not whether it happened historically or not. In fact, that's the least important thing about it, despite what most Christians believe. It's what it represents. What the resurrection represents is spiritual rebirth. It's very fitting that I should return to do this live stream today, because the 7th and last live stream that I made last year was called Crucify Yourself, and it was about the symbolic meaning of the crucifixion of Yeshua. It's about dying to self. It's about overcoming your ego. Yeshua's central teaching was that one must die to themselves so that they can truly find life. And the crucifixion is that very teaching writ large in the most dramatic way possible. Whether you want to say it happened historically or not, that is the point of the crucifixion narratives. It's symbolic of how we are meant to die to ourselves so that we can be alive in the spirit. By the same token, the point of the resurrection is less about whether it happened historically and more about the fact that it represents the kind of spiritual rebirth that is testified of in every single culture around the world. And that's why, as I love to say, the Apostle Paul, understanding this perfectly well, he said, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. He told those who read his letters that they should crucify themselves. Now, obviously, the Apostle Paul didn't mean that he himself had been literally crucified, and nor was he suggesting that those who read his letters should literally go and crucify themselves. He was talking about overcoming their egoic identity, caring less about themselves to be made alive in the spirit. So that's the importance of the resurrection, and I find it ironic that both philosophical materialists and religionists miss this point, because in both cases, as far as they're concerned, it's either literally true or it's completely worthless, when the reality is that the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, they are allegories intended to convey deep spiritual truth, and the crucifixion and the resurrection are symbolic of dying to yourself to be raised to new spiritual life, to be born again. That's the importance of them. Whether or not these events happened historically, it's quite beyond our knowing. It's the spiritual significance that ultimately matters. And I really feel that there are certain, because that fact is missed, because the fact that this is really about an experience here and now, less than substantiating an event that happened 2,000 years ago, because of that, I really feel that certain other details are missed. There are so many occurrences or so many things said within the New Testament that I see as clear references to resurrection life that aren't usually taken that way, because whether religionist or philosophical materialist, the crucifixion and the resurrection are focused on as events in history when they're meant to be teachings regarding spiritual transformation. And I think the best example of this is the famous parable of the prodigal son, which is given in the Gospel of Luke chapter 15, and only in the Gospel of Luke. If I was to choose from my favourite of the synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark and Luke, it would definitely be the Gospel of Luke, because there are so many things in that Gospel that don't happen in Matthew and Mark, and there are so many parables in that Gospel that aren't in Matthew and Mark, and the parable of the prodigal son is one of them. So I'm going to do an old-fashioned Bible reading here, and here's another thing about me looking into the world of literary agents and approaching them, is that let me just say this, I'll put it this way. I can't remember what it's like to be a normal person anymore. I will happily take out my Bible and start elaborating on things from the Bible, and it just doesn't occur to me these days that that's just not the done thing. I keep forgetting that I live in the United Kingdom, a very secular country, and that I live in Scotland, an even more secular country. And so I have to check myself sometimes and say to myself, remember David, remember who you're speaking to here, remember where you are. You're going to come across as very, very bizarre to them unless you explain what you're doing and why. You can't just whip out a Bible and start explaining things, because they're just thinking to themselves, who is this guy speaking about God and destiny and reading from the Bible? This is bizarre, I'm not used to this. So I've got to be very conscious of that, I found. But yes, we're going to do a good old-fashioned Bible reading today. Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son. I love this so much, and I'm sure this parable has been explained in the ways I'm going to explain it, at least to some degree. But, okay, so Yeshua said concerning the parable, Yeshua said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the young son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. I'm reading from the English Standard Version translation, which is a rather formal translation. And sometimes, even though I like formal translations, it's not quite as poetic as it could be. It's rather straightforward. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. So you've got this son. He's going to receive an inheritance from his father when his father dies, but he's greedy and he's hasty, and he says to his father, look, forget that, look, just give me what's coming to me now. And having received that, he goes away into a foreign land. Unfortunately, in that foreign land, there's a famine, and the son, having squandered all of his inheritance, he ends up destitute, and he ends up feeding pigs to make a living, essentially. And he sometimes finds himself envying those pigs because they have more to eat than he does. But when the son came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. So this is a very well-known story, of course, and is typically given as a story that emphasizes the importance and the beauty of forgiveness, essentially. But for me, this is clearly a parable essentially concerning the whole journey of the soul. The Son, of course, is the individual soul. As the Apostle Paul said, all those who are led by the sons of God, these are the sons of God. This, we are these souls, of course, and we are initially with the Father. And I actually use that in my book when I'm explaining forgiveness, but I think next week I'll talk about what I call the ethereal realms, which are the heavenly spiritual realms. It's a very dense subject, as you might imagine. So as souls, in my view, we pre-existed our birth in this world. We existed, as the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden illustrates or conveys. We existed with God, but we made the choice to incarnate here in the world. And in this parable, that's what is representative of the soul leaving the Father to go to far-off lands. God manifested as multitudinous souls so that he might experience limitation. He might experience all kinds of diversity here in the material realm. So as a soul, we leave the bosom of the Father, as it were, and we venture down here into the material realm. And for a time, we enjoy our lives here in the material realm. And so, the bane of every parent, for example, is the fact that their child is very adventurous. Their child wants to explore new things. That's because as souls, especially souls that are newly incarnated here in the material realm, we love to experience that kind of limitation and that kind of danger. As I say, it's the bane of every parent. But what happens, whether it's in a single lifetime or multiple lifetimes here in the material realm, is that we eventually begin to suffer. We get weary of the experience that we once longed to have, and we tire of it. And that's what the son's plight in that foreign land is all about. Here this son had all this inheritance, and he left his father, and he squandered it ultimately. But ultimately hardship comes upon him, and he begins to reflect on the fact that he has essentially left his father, and he desires to return there. That's what suffering does for us here in the material realm. We enjoy the material realm for a time, but eventually we grow weary of it. And it's always through suffering that we eventually come to seek the spiritual, because suffering is that which, as I like to say, fractures our egoic identity. It's why so many transformative spiritual experiences, what a Christian might call born-again experiences, it's why they so often happen when a soul is at its lowest point. It's because when a soul is at its lowest point, its egoic identity is fractured, and it's more open to transcendent experiences. And so again, that's why transformative experiences so often happen when a soul is undergoing great suffering. And at that point, a soul, just like the prodigal son, it will decide to seek the Father, as it were. It will decide, in practical terms, to start asking the big questions in life. What is this really all about? Is there really a spiritual dimension to life? Or is this material reality that I see about me all that there is? So it's when a soul has suffered enough here in the material realm that it will begin to ask these questions, and it's that what initiates their spiritual journey, as it were, and they will eventually find their way home, just as the prodigal son did. Now, when I talk about this parable in my book, I talk about a much lamented seeming inconsistency within Christianity. And it's true, it is an inconsistency, because for as much as I criticize atheists and philosophical materialists, they do quite often have good points. And so one example is that Yeshua is portrayed as telling his disciples to be endlessly forgiving. And so on one occasion, Peter comes up and asks Yeshua, how many times should I forgive my brother? To which Yeshua essentially says that he should forgive his brother an infinite number of times. However many times your brother asks for forgiveness, you should give him that forgiveness. And so it's often been pointed out that it's strange that Yeshua encourages such forgiveness, but at the same time, the way that Christians portray God is that he will send someone to a place of eternal torment for deviating from one of his laws, essentially. And so this is a serious objection that needs to be answered. Why is it that Yeshua essentially expects his disciples to be far more forgiving than Christians portray God as being? Now, actually, the answer to this is quite extensive. First of all, hell is an experience that begins here in mortal form. Hell, the way that one enters into hell is to act against one's own conscience consistently. Once you act against your own conscience consistently, you no longer hear from that conscience, and you become what is called a lost soul. And your mind and your ethereal form is racked with all kinds of abrasive phenomenon, essentially. You can look about you in your day-to-day life and you can see plenty of souls that are very clearly in hell as they're wandering around in mortal form. Now, if the mortal form of a soul dies while it's in that state, then it will enter into that which is typically taken to be hell. But here's the important lesson about the parable of the prodigal son, is that just as how in that parable, despite what the prodigal son thought, the father did not hold anything against the son. See, this is the really important thing. I mean, I could spend the next hour elaborating upon the significance of this particular parable, but this is the point I really want to emphasize. The prodigal son believed, after he'd squandered his wealth, and when the famine had arisen and he realized how sorry a state he was in, he was still convinced that he would have to return to his father and acknowledge the fact that he was no longer worthy to be a son. He would be forced to become a servant himself, and his state of misery was such that he would be glad with that. He would be content with that. But that's not what happened. In fact, when the prodigal son returned to his father instantly forgave him and acknowledged him as a son. And this is exactly what happens, and this is what it's symbolic of, is that so often we think that, we've done all these terrible things in the past, our conscience is playing us, we failed God, we failed this soul and that soul, we are no longer worthy of being sons of God. It's something that everyone goes through, I think. And the important point, at least as far as that section of the parable is concerned, is that we have no idea just how all-loving and all-forgiving God actually is. He is far more all-loving and all-forgiving than Christians so often portray him as being. Now, if the prodigal son's destitute state in that foreign country is symbolic of a really hellish spiritual state, which it is, the question we've got to ask ourselves is, who rescued the prodigal son from that state? And who was keeping him there? The answer is himself. It was the prodigal son. It was the decisions that the prodigal son had made that resulted in him ending up destitute in a foreign country away from the father. In the exact same way that it's our own decisions as souls that takes us into these dark places, these low spiritual states. And we may believe that we are stuck in those states, and we may believe that God no longer has any forgiveness or love for us, and is no longer willing to acknowledge us as his child. But the whole point of the parable of the prodigal son is that that's not the case, and the only ones keeping us in any kind of hellish, lowly spiritual state, the only ones keeping us there are ourselves, because if we, like the prodigal son, are only willing to turn once again to the Father, then we will be forgiven and we will be acknowledged as children. That's the most important point of the parable of the prodigal son. It's not the only point. I just don't have time to elaborate upon it any further, because of course there's an additional element, namely that the prodigal son has an older brother, and that older brother was always loyal to the father. And so when the prodigal son returns and the father forgives him, this older son, he's quite resentful of this. He says, hey, this guy betrayed you. He squandered his inheritance. I never did that. I never squandered your inheritance. I've been here by your side all this time, and yet you've never thrown the kind of celebration for me that you've just thrown for this for my brother now that he's returned. And that relates to something else that Yeshua taught often, which is that he who is last will be first, and so forth. Is that the race to the kingdom of heaven, as it were, is not to be understood in human terms. And the one who has honoured God all this time has no reason to be resentful of those who find redemption. And that's what that latter part of the parable is about, but I don't have time to get into that just now. But that's what I really wanted to emphasise. Now you may ask, well, wait a minute, this is Easter Sunday, and you said that the parable of the prodigal son was about resurrection. And yes, it is, because the only way, if we acknowledge our hellish state, if we acknowledge that we really can't do without God, and we desire to return to God, the only way to return to God is through the very spiritual rebirth that the resurrection represents. That's why the parable of the prodigal son is indeed, despite what most people think, is indeed about the resurrection. Because the only way, in real terms, that a prodigal son can return to the Father, to receive the forgiveness that is always being extended, is through the kind of spiritual rebirth that Yeshua taught, and that the resurrection itself is symbolic of. And so that's why I say the parable of the prodigal son does indeed relate to the subject of resurrection. Leo asks, would you say that your conscience is the same as what you most sincerely believe is the right action? You can have voices in your head that are negative and not true. Another comment that almost seems contrived. It almost seems like I got a bunch of people behind the scenes to ask the exact right questions that I'd want to answer. I'm going to read you a little bit from my book. I've got to be careful doing this these days because I don't think. Well, I can't read the whole thing out, but I'll just read what I wrote, our little passage, our little paragraph that I wrote on the subject of the conscience. Chapter 2, I think. Yeah. You see, this book is called Experiential Spirituality, The Mystic Answer to Everything. And it's not called The Mystic Answer to Everything for no reason. The scope of this book is enormous. There isn't a single question that I don't think this book answers, either directly or indirectly. So here's what I say in chapter 2 on the subject of the conscience, or here's one of the things that I say. I've actually got a whole section on the conscience and intuition. I say, many times in your life have you employed your intellect in order to determine what the morally correct action to take in a certain situation was, and many times have you come to the wrong conclusion by doing so, but never once have you obeyed your conscience only to be misled into moral error. Every soul should be in awe, having recognized this. Now, it is often the case that obeying your conscience can lead to your physical, mental, or ethereal body suffering, since making the morally correct decision often means making a form of sacrifice, but that you did make the morally correct decision is never in doubt. And in that particular section, I essentially explain that what souls call the conscience and the intuition, that's nothing more than the voice of God speaking through your shared spirit. We call conscience and intuition by different things because we experience them in different contexts. So we experience what we call the conscience in the context of making moral decisions. We experience what we call the intuition in areas where we're trying to make practical decisions, and that's why, when we're living in human form, we distinguish between the two. But the reality is that the same phenomenon is the voice of God speaking through our shared spirit. And as a consequence of that, when you develop in your spirituality, you become, and you essentially come to know yourself, as it were, your own spiritual essence. You no longer experience your conscience and your intuition as you once did, and you no longer experience them as being distinct. Because essentially the voice of God always speaks to our idea of who we are. If we are living under the impression that we are an isolated human being in the world that has no relationship with God, we will hear from our conscience and our intuition as though it is almost like something separate inside of us that is speaking to us. Whereas when you begin to know your true spiritual essence, they are more experienced as as an innate knowingness, because that's what they fundamentally are. And so, to answer the question, would you say that your conscience is the same as what you most sincerely believe is the right action? You can have voices in your head that are negative and not true. Yes, it's very important to distinguish between the conscience and the mind, because the mind can be saying all kinds of things. The mind will tell you to do all kinds of things, and it's often wrong. The conscience is never wrong. Again, if you obey your conscience, there is never any doubt that you are making the morally correct decision, and that's because it's the way that God speaks to us. And again, this is something else that I feel most religionists are missing the point. They want you to, I love the Bible. I've just spent a fair bit of time elaborating on a parable from it. But they want you to make your guide for life. Now let me ask you this. If there is a God, right, and if God is willing to guide us, why would we ever need to be guided by a book? The fact is that the conscience, as far as morality is concerned, the conscience is meant to be our guide. I'm not trying to go Jiminy Cricket here, but that's the truth. The conscience is meant to be our guide. It's the way that God speaks to us. And so, more than studying any sacred text in this world, what souls should be doing is paying more attention to their conscience, because in doing that, they're paying attention to God. And again, no one has ever had an experience of their conscience leading them astray morally. As I say in the book, sometimes following your conscience, it can lead your physical body, your mental body, and your ethereal form to suffer, because that's just the cost of being a good person sometimes. If someone's walking up ahead of you and they drop their wallet, and you pick up their wallet and it has £50 in it, $50. See, I'm diverse. $50 in it. You would benefit from keeping that $50. But of course, your conscience is going to be telling you, no, run and catch up with that person and give them their money back. And so, of course, you're going to suffer practically for having done that, because you could have done with $50, but you know that the morally correct thing to do is to give that wallet back to that soul. And that's all we have to do in this world. That's all God expects us to do, is to obey our conscience. And if souls would do that, then we would truly live in a different world. What souls instead do is they rely on their own mind, and so even when they are all deferring to the same sacred texts, they are necessarily having to employ their mind to interpret that text. So the conclusions they come away with, having read a text like the Bible, they have as much to do with their own psychology as they do with what the text actually says, and that's where the problems arise. That's where the destructive diversity arises, even within the same denominations. The conscience is all you need as far as moral guidance is concerned, and the path to the kind of spiritual rebirth, or a big part of undergoing the kind of spiritual rebirth that the story of the resurrection represents, is learning to heed your conscience and learning to heed your intuition. Not just heed them, but actually obey them, because there's a big difference between heeding something and actually obeying it. If someone, God is not forceful. There's a reason that God is called graceful, and grace can mean many things, usually unmerited favour. But God is graceful in the way that, God doesn't force himself upon us. Our conscience doesn't force us to do what is the morally correct thing. It simply says, hey, this is the morally correct thing to do in this circumstance, and it's up to us whether we want to obey that conscience or not. God is not going to impose himself on us by assuming direct control. But of course, if you consistently ignore your conscience, you stop hearing from it. That's when your conscience becomes seared, or you just become deaf to your conscience, and that represents God saying, okay, I've consistently given you, or I've consistently tried to give you moral guidance. You have not heeded me once, and so clearly you're not interested in receiving my moral guidance, therefore I will stop talking to you. And when someone gets to that state, when someone gets to the state that they no longer hear from their conscience, well, that's when they have to rely on moral codes and written rules, because at that point they have nothing else to go by. But most souls in this world, whatever their religious beliefs are or are not, they still hear from their conscience, and all they have to do is foster that relationship, as it were. But I've now spoken for far longer than I intended. Or have I? How long do I usually make these? I've completely forgotten. Because I'm so focused on living like in the present as much as possible, it's incredible how much slips my mind. And not because I'm forgetful by nature, but just because I don't care to retain it. You know, I deliberately let things fall from my mind, but it does mean I have to refresh myself on many things on occasion. Okay. There has been one episode of Experiential Spirituality previously that was longer than this, but only one, so I better stop there. I had to write down in my show notes what my sign-off was because I'd completely forgotten. So thank you very much for watching, everyone. As I said at the beginning, you can't expect too much from this particular episode because I'm just warming up again. It's been a long time since I did any kind of live stream at all, but I feel that it went okay. So thank you very much for watching, everyone, and may your moment be mystical. I also hope the wind wasn't too loud. It's just the way it is up here just now. Oh, and please let me know if the volume on the microphone was okay, because during the last 7 episodes that I did, a lot of people said the volume was too low. The thing is, when you're doing live streams like this, you're trying to find a balance between having the microphone be sensitive enough to pick up your voice clearly, but not being so sensitive that it also picks up the background noise. Now, the problem with you, Neurocraft, is that I don't know whether you're being serious or sarcastic. Are you being serious by saying that the audio could use some boosting? Is that for real? Nicholas says, what could you say about God speaking through the conscience and his voice getting duller the less you... Yeah. Okay. Well, you can let me know in the comments if the audio really was too low. The mic volume is fine, the stream volume is low. Are you trolling me? I don't even understand what that means. The mic volume is fine, the stream volume is low. How do you know that? How do you know which volume is off? Please explain that to me in the comments. The mic gain. How do you know? See, Neurocraft, you worry me sometimes. How do you know that? I guess you've just got a trained ear for this kind of thing. So are you saying that essentially in OBS I should up the volume? Because the gain on the back of the microphone, I just put it in the middle, to be honest with you. So yeah, maybe in OBS I should up the volume somewhat. I'm glad you don't hear much wind. Okay, so if it's agreed upon, then with with next week's live stream, I'll put the sound up a notch. We'll get this sorted eventually. It's just going to be a process of refinement, I think. But I'm going to stop there. I should have stopped sooner because now this is officially the longest stream. Again, thank you very much for watching, everyone, and may your moment be mystical. I'll see you next Sunday, every Sunday at 1 PM GMT. I'm going to be very rigorous about this. Thank you.